and gentlemen, I see that unlike Danny Qua yesterday, I didn't get my name on the first slide, so I'm Christopher Johnson, and Lionel Robbins is my father-in-law, his daughter, my wife Anne, is here in the front row, so it's very nice for the Robbins family to be able to preside over these lectures every year. This is the first series of lectures we've had about France. Now that makes it rather remarkable because you'd think France, being a neighbouring country, would be an object of great interest to the British. Well, of course it is, as I can testify, having been Paris correspondent of the Times and Financial Times longer ago than I care to remember. But what I can tell you is that there was a period of history when the British looked up to the French as the masters of economic growth. We even imitated the French plan, not very successfully, but then it ended up not very successfully in France either. But while France was catching up after the war, Britain was still growing very slowly. So we thought France must have some secret we didn't have. And then suddenly everything moved in the other direction. After Mrs. Thatcher had done a certain amount of damage, but also perhaps some benefits to the British economy, Britain started growing faster than France. And it so happens that this covered the 10 years of Tony Blair's premiership. Now I have to keep telling the French, look, we haven't really discovered the secret of growth, and you can see that's true now because we're much worse off today than France in the recession. So we have this picture of two friendly rival countries. One decade, one is up and the other is down, and then vice versa. So I think there's a great deal that we can learn from each other, and I'm going to ask Philippe Aghion to give us some of the lessons of growth. But I must first just tell you one story about French regulation, which is always thought to be very hostile to growth, and they have plenty of it, more than we do. But one area where the French were very successful was in regulating the cultivation of oysters. And if you wonder why it's so difficult to get cheap oysters in Britain, then you should realize that we overfished our oysters, we didn't regulate the growth of the oyster beds. The French have regulated oysters for many centuries, and now they're very plentiful in France. That was the subject of a famous economic journal article by the late Robert Niels of Cambridge University, and I hope he enjoyed his oysters when he went to France. I know I did. Thank you very much.
So today it will be kind of more marathon, because I have to cover two topics, so of course I cannot be exhaustive, and I just want to give you a flavor, but I think there are important topics for future research on growth, and I hope, and in fact I think they will spur a lot of research. There is a big research programs on each of the topics I will address, and so they are just, the first one will be the link between macroeconomic policy and growth, and I think that's timely because now we will all be involved into, to which extent should we have a stimulus package to, restart our economies, and the question is that important for long-run growth? Is it important the fact that governments react to the business cycle more or less has an impact on long-run growth? And that's kind of an issue which is in fact controversial among macroeconomists, because when you learn intermediate macro or macro, it's very much seen that there is a decoupling between macroeconomic policy on the one hand and long-run growth. The view is that if you do even to Trichet or to central bankers, they will say, well, the long-run growth essentially is driven by structural factors, product market, competition, whatever, labor market, institutions of various kinds, investment in knowledge, higher education, like we saw yesterday, and what you want to get from macroeconomic policy is essentially what you call macroeconomic stability. You don't want excessive inflation because then people stop investing, and so you would just look for macroeconomic stability in the way IMF has always looked at it. You see what I mean? And that's it. But beyond that, it's all structural. And we want to kind of take the view that the things are different. And in fact, it matters for long-run growth how you conduct fiscal and monetary policy over the business cycle. So there's a big debate, you know, on the European, on the policy of the ECB, although now they start lowering interest rates, finally, and a debate on the stability and growth plan that, you know, restricts the extent to which we can run a budget deficit in bad times. And in fact, for many aspects of growth of European policy are going against governments in Europe that want to say, you know, we may have to help sectors or we may have to do things, and that's a kind of interesting debate. You see how we can, you know, deal with people in Brussels while fighting this crisis. Of course, you have part of the problem, but not the whole problem, because you have at least an independent, monetary policy, and you are not subject to the Stability and Growth Pact. So, for example, does it matter for long-run growth that the Eurozone shows less counter-cyclical deficit than US and UK? So this picture shows you over the year the variation of structural deficits on the horizontal axis and the variation in short-term interest rate on the vertical axis. So if you want the horizontal measures the money, the budgetary policy, and the vertical measures the monetary policy. And what you see is that you have big swings in the US and the UK. You see. You react a lot and they react a lot in the US to bad times, okay? That was done, of course, that's outdated. It doesn't include, you know, since 1 year or 2 years. But the Eurozone, you see, we barely move. You see, they would, of course, that's before the big crisis, and now, of course, they realize they have to move. But you see, if you look at the interest rates, but also how governments react, you see, you have very little movement over the business cycle in the Eurozone. And you ask yourself, is that a big deal? This difference between this and these big swings, is that a big deal or not a big deal? Should we make anything of it which is relevant for growth? And so what I want to argue is that, and here you can see the counter-cyclicality, the cyclicality of budgetary policy of government debt. You see that, for example, the UK has become much more counter-cyclical. The US over the years, the US as well. But you see, for example, the EU, the EMU zone, you know, has barely become more counter-cyclical over the years. Of course, I'm excluding since 1 year. So that's the question: is that a big deal or not a big deal? And I should keep going. And in fact, I want to argue that that's a big deal. In fact, I want to look for the relationship between cyclical macroeconomic policy. Here I look at fiscal and long-run growth, and therefore challenge the traditional dichotomy between short-term stabilization and long-run growth. So here I will argue that when you are in a world where you have credit-constrained firms and sectors, there you see macroeconomic volatility is harmful for growth because firms reduce productivity enhancing investment when they expect more volatile shocks. You see, when you do R&D investment and you know typically, and you know that in bad times you will have cash flow problems and therefore investment problems, you will have to cut on your R&D. Then you won't engage in R&D in the first place because R&D is something that you have to keep going. You see what I mean? If you think that at any bad time you have to cut it, you don't engage in it in the first place, you see. And so, in fact, there is this effect that's how the short run affects the long run. If firms don't have the guarantee that somehow they'll be sustained in a certain way, in the right way, not in the wrong way, in recessions, they might not engage into long-term R&D or structural investments. So the idea is that in a world like this with credit constraint firms, of course if you're not credit constrained it's no big deal because when you have low cash flow you could always borrow up to the net present value of your profits, of the flow of profits, and that would be no problem. But of course when you are credit constrained, what you can borrow is a multiple of your cash flow, and when you are in a period of low cash flow, that's what you... And of course, you know, people would say there is a kind of a good side of recession. There was this old Schumpeterian idea that there is a virtue of bad times, that in bad times that's where you question yourself and do other things. But that's true, but you know, the problem is when you have credit constraints, you would like to do other things, but you can't. You see, so yeah. And of course, you want to help firms in a way that would not prevent you know, that would not, you know, say, because I get a lot of cash from the government, I don't need to change things. That you don't want that. But you would like to make possible, make it life good for firms that want to innovate. So it's not that you want to help firms that would just have a quiet life in recession, in bad times. You would like also to help, you would like in fact to help firms that want to do something, that they can do something. You see, that's the way you want to think of the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So the approach, and now there can be a straightforward approach to that, and which is to say, well, what we call counter-cyclical fiscal policy? Well, you look at typical, you know, fiscal surplus or fiscal deficit, and that's this variable, fiscal surplus, and you can regress it, so your regression, and you could regress it over the output gap. Output gap is the difference between current output and trend output. And when the gap is bigger, typically you will have counter-cyclicality, that when you have a bigger gap, you have a coefficient here which is negative in front of the gap. You see, when you have a bigger gap, in fact, you do more fiscal deficit, you see, to counteract the fact that you have a big output gap. So, this measure that you derive, you can then plug in and you can say, well, how does growth in countries depend on the extent to which they have counter-cyclical fiscal policy? And more or less whether or not they are highly financially developed or low financial development. So I've done kind of previous work, which was cross-country panel, looking at distinguishing between countries, because there are countries that are more financially developed than others, and trying to argue that it was particularly bad for countries with low financial development not to have counter-cyclical fiscal policies for their growth, you see. But there is all kind of econometric issues there, because you have to estimate these varying, you want to use, because we have few countries, you need to really play on the panel dimension, and you need to estimate the counter-cyclicality by year. And doing that is a kind of very cumbersome method, and that makes it very difficult to deal with endogeneity issues. So you can do cross-country panel, but it's a kind of problematic and difficult to do. So I have a paper in the NBR macro annual where I try to do that, but that, you know, doesn't work. It has problems. I mean, and there is nothing you can do about that. It's a bit like when you do education cross-country. It doesn't work so well. You can do all what you want, but it goes as far as it goes. Okay, so you have again to go to our more micro regressions. Okay, so what I will do here is that I will say, well, and also going, because you are concerned about reverse causality. You see, well, if suppose you see that counter-cyclical fiscal policy is good for growth when you have more financially constrained firms, does it, suppose that you see a correlation that goes in that direction, does it say that it's the causality from cyclical policy to growth? It could be the causality from growth to cyclical policy. It could be that high growth reduces public debt, and therefore, when you have reduced public debt, it's easier to cut tax or raise expenditure in bad times. So how can you know that you are capturing the causality, again, from the policy to the growth, and not from the growth to the policy? Okay, so again, you have to deal with the issue, like we have for education yesterday. So what I will do here is to go cross-sector. So we will look at cross-sector, cross-country. We take OECD countries and they have sectors. And to deal with the endogeneity issue, we will say, well, sectors, you see, they are, these sectors have equivalent in the US. So we look at many countries except the US, but in the US they have equivalent that are more or less financially dependent. They are more or less dependent on external finance. And so the prediction we will try to test is that counter-cyclical fiscal policy in the country is particularly good for growth in sectors whose equivalent in the US rely a lot on external finance. Those are sectors that are more likely to be credit constrained. And that gives you a measure of exogeneity, because how much you are credit constrained in the US, you see, does not depend upon what's going on in the other country, you see, or very little. So that's how you solve you see the endogeneity. You try to address the endogeneity issue, you see, by having this method. So let me just show you how we do. So the main regression equation is like this. You take a sector I in country J over a certain time period, and you look at the average growth rate. It could be value-added growth over that period or labor productivity growth. Okay? And you regress that guy over this alpha I is what we call it's an industry fixed effect. So it could be that you have characteristic of industries that make them grow faster or slower, intrinsically, because it's that kind of industry. You want to take this out. You want to control for that. You want also to control for country fixed effect, and then you regress on the interaction between the extent to which the sector has financial dependence in the US, the extent to which the same sector in the US depend on external finance, interacted, so that's a variable which is sector dependent, and interacted with the extent to which you have a counter-cyclical policy in the country. So the idea is that when you have a more counter-cyclical policy in the country, it's particularly good for growth for sectors that exhibit higher degree of financial dependence in the US. Okay, so that, and here we control for initial. Let me just because here I do everything without. Here we control for you see for log of initial conditions, this initial income, and that's the white term. Okay, so that's the regression. And the second regression, and now of course you have to estimate the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So that will be the first stage. That's the second stage equation, and you need a third stage where you estimate this guy. How you estimate this guy? So that's the following slide. What you do is that you regress over a certain time period a fiscal variable, which can be primary fiscal balance, total fiscal balance over GDP, government revenues, government expenditure, or government consumption, or government investment. So that's the kind of guy you regress, and you regress it over the output gap in the country at a given time. So you take a certain time period, and you do, for the country, a panel regression, you see, to regress, to get one coefficient for the average degree, if you want, of counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy in that country over that time period, you see. And that's how you derive this ingredient. You see, it's like cooking. You have a pan, no? You do some onions, and then you put, once you derive this from this auxiliary cooking, you put it back here, and that becomes the guy you interact with financial dependence of the sector to look at the effect on growth. Okay, we are in agreement there, so far so good. If you are lost here, we are lost. I mean, don't interrupt me if, okay, so that's what we are doing. So what are the data? So we have three sources of data, okay? So we focus on industrialized OECD countries. So first, you remember that I told you that Easterly believes that, once you control for institutions like expropriation, then, policy has no effect. Well, that's a way to answering to Mr. Easterly, because here you have countries that in terms, so maybe now you will say since the last crisis, we in fact discover we are bad countries, all of us, but we are among countries that Easterly would have considered to be normal countries, believe it or not, okay? So OECD countries are all countries that qualify the normality test of Easterly, and still we will say huge effect of policy on growth, okay? So that's a kind of big way to get back to Easterly and say, to do the race as you did, you missed something, okay? So you have three three types of data sets. Okay, the first data set is industry level data, which will be useful to measure productivity growth and value-added growth. And this is a data set which has 18 OECD countries, 45 manufacturing industries over these countries, over a time span of 25 years. So that's a very nice data set. Now, Amadeus is a kind of extended form of this, which is cross-industry, cross-country developed, okay? But that's a kind of... so that's for the industry level data for productivity growth, value-added growth. Then you have the financial dependence data from Rajan Zinga's 98 and an updated version of it, which is Radat's 2006. They are based on CompuStat, which gathers balance sheets, data, and income statements from US listed firms, the firms that are listed on stock markets. And the data cover the period 1890. And then the macro variables, which is fiscal and control variables, are drawn from OECD Economic Outlook or the World Bank Financial Structure and Development data set, and the time span is identical to the one of the industry level data. Okay, so now I'll show you a few tables, and we try to learn from that. Okay, so this is the basic table. I regress total fiscal, I regress growth, value-added growth in a sector, as a function of the interaction between the cyclicality of total fiscal balance in the country interacted with the extent to which this sector is more or less financially dependent in the US, okay? And what you see is that whichever time period you take, you find a high and highly significant at the 1% level interaction coefficient between external financial dependence and total fiscal balance, you see? So the more financially dependent, the more it's good for growth of the sector that you have in the country a counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And in fact, I've done some work now on firm level, where you find very similar thing at firm level. But that's just for France, and I don't have that. I don't have a cross country on that. So then you can, and it's stable over a period. You can now do primary fiscal balance. So you don't factor in interest payments, but it's instead of the total fiscal balance, and you find similarly that the cyclicality, the counter-cyclicality in the primary fiscal balance interacted with external financial dependence is strongly positive and significant. You see, so it's very important for long-run growth how you do your short-run macro policy. I keep going. So now we look at productivity growth instead of just value-added growth, and you find also again very significant coefficient, but they are a little bit lower. And in fact, they are 70% of the what you have for the value-added growth, because in fact 70% of the effect goes through productivity, and 30% goes through added labor. When you are more counter-cyclical firms, hire more people. So part of it is a volume effect, and part of it is a productivity effect. And you can factor, you can look at which fraction is firms hiring more people and which fraction is firms innovating more. So that's what you get from this. Oops. So that's the that's the scatter plot corresponding to the last regression. So now you could say, well, you can keep going. You say, well, you have in fact sectors which are good. They are not in need. You have sectors which have in fact a negative external financial dependence. Those are sectors for which the capital expenditure is less than the amount of retained earnings. So they have a surplus of funds, not enough. You see what I mean? So those sectors, if you have those sectors, the financial dependence is negative. If you found a positive coefficient on the interaction between financial dependence and counter-cyclicality, it would mean for those sectors that you want a pro-cyclical fiscal policy, not a counter-cyclical, because minus by minus is a plus. Okay? So far you understand this one? No, I understand. So the thing is that we say, well, I want to make sure that this is not happening. So what we do here is that we separate sectors in between those who have positive external dependence in the US and those who have negative external dependence. And you see that the sign is negative for those of those, which is exactly what you want, for those of the sectors that have negative external financial dependence. So also for those sectors, you want counter-cyclical policy, although it's less significant than for the positive external finance. You see, so that's what you get from this, and that's the same here with primary fiscal balance and productivity growth. Again, you find that the signs are negative for the negative financial dependence and positive for the positive financial dependence. Both of them need counter-cyclical fiscal policies. So now you have like question you can ask. You can ask yourself, well, how big are these effects? Are those big effects or not? Maybe those are very small effects after all. The second question you want to ask, okay, you want to do counter-cyclical fiscal, but you have many ways of doing deficit. You can reduce taxes or increase spending. Or you can have government consumption, government investment, and more transfers. You see, I mean, you have various ways of doing it. So you want to open a bit of black box. What does matter there? Okay, what is important? And also you want to try some control. So does the effect of fiscal policy survive the inclusion of controls describing fiscal policy itself or structural characteristics of the economy? So let me just run through a few tests there. So, for example, here what we do is we compute growth gain in an industry that moves from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile in external finance. So you aggravate this external finance. You take a sector and you say you are a low tercile of external finance, you go to low quartile and you go to the high quartile of external finance. And you move from a country with a low degree of counter-cyclical policy to a country with high degree of counter-cyclical policy. When you do these two things, by how much does growth in your sector increase? And it increases, you see the value-added growth, depending on the time period you choose, varies between the gain is between 1.3% and 1.7%. Or if you look at productivity growth, it's between 0.86 and 1.36%. So that's, now you say, well, is that big or is that small? Well, in fact, you see, Aghion Zingales, when they did their initial study on interacting financial dependence and financial development, they tried to see, to which extent when you move from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile in the interaction between financial dependence and financial development, by how much does growth increase? And they found data, they found comparable magnitude, they found 1%. So you find that the effects of the equivalent as Aghion Zingales had effects, where there it was just the interaction between financial dependence and financial development in the country, financial dependence in the sector and financial dependence and then financial constraint in the country. So it's a Aghion Zingales comparable magnitude effect. Okay, so that's quite big. So and again, 70% of the increase in value added stems from an increase in labor productivity. The other 30% stems from increase in employment. Okay, so that's the magnitude. Now you want to look at revenue versus expenditure. Should you want to reduce tax for firms or to increase expenditure? And what's very interesting here is that you find that expenditure doesn't seem to have a big effect. Sometimes it does, but not that much. So it's not really the expenditure side that you want to be counter-cyclical. So on the other hand, when you look at the government spending counter-cyclicality, which is here, there you find big effects. So that's interesting. You might ask yourself, why is it? So for example, you say you could have counter-cyclicality by reducing tax of that firm's pay in bad times. That's like reducing your revenues. You're not increasing your spending, you are reducing your tax revenues. Well, that doesn't have so much of an effect. And now you may ask, why is that? So it could be several reasons. One could be that you have a demand channel at work. That firms, in fact, is because they have a demand for products that they innovate more. So I think my take on it is this moral hazard. If I just give tax holidays to firms, they sleep, you see? They just like my, Egyptian ancestors, huh? But if they, oh well, God, I don't want to insult Egypt, by the way. My ancestors in Egypt, not those. But if you just give, if you tell them, look, I will spend more on clean, like Obama says, I will spend more on clean, I will induce clean innovations, building things, then, and I will do procurement, I will have, I will organize race between firms to get the procurement contract, and then you induce innovation, you see? And that's the way to do it. So that tells you something that how you should run a counter-cyclical policy. There might be a good way and a bad way, and that's very much in the debates on stimulus packages that you are having now. Huh? So that's not irrelevant. Okay, so now I want to just look now at various aspects of economies that say maybe we're capturing something else than what we are capturing. You see, that's always they tell you. You show regression. Oh, that's very nice regression. But you're capturing something else than what you think you are capturing. So you could say, well, it could be that, current account matters. For example, if you are in a country with current account deficit, presumably you have a lot of capital inflows. Typically, firms are more able to attract capital, and they should not be the same as in countries that have current account surpluses, where maybe typically firms may be more starved of cash and financing. So you want to see whether it makes a difference, and you see that it doesn't. If you control for current account balance interacted with financial dependence, you see they are never significant, and it doesn't affect the coefficients on the interaction between counter-cyclical fiscal policy and financial dependence. So that's not it doesn't play a big role, okay? So now it's more interesting one, it's inflation. So now you move to monetary policy. See, there is a lot, all of those are papers to write. So for those who are in thesis, here, each of them is a paper, huh? Free of charge. So, oh God, where is the inflation? Oh la la. No, I want my inflation. Where is my inflation? Excellent, excellent. I have it. Okay, inflation. Well, if you are in a country with higher inflation, typically, well, the problem with inflation is that the financial systems, when you have high inflation, allocates capital less efficiently. It should be particularly harmful for industries with high financial dependence, because for those guys who need capital to flow in, investors will have more difficulty in identifying the good and the bad investments when you have higher inflation. That's typically an effect that you have when you have higher inflation. So what you should observe is that typically growth in industries that are more financially dependent are those who would suffer particularly with inflation. Inflation is particularly bad for growth in industries that are more in need of reallocation of capital inflows, okay? But now, that's exactly what you find here. You see, that's very interesting. Oh God, I just go. It's just what I get here. You see, all these interactions are positive significant, negative significant. The higher inflation, the worse it is for growth to high. You see, the more you are financially dependent on external finance, the worse for growth it is to have high inflation in the country. So you find that effect. But controlling for that does not affect the interplay between counter-cyclical fiscal policy and the financial dependence of the sector, you see? So the inflation story is there, but it's a story which is on top of the story I'm telling about the fiscal policy. So that's interesting in itself, because there is, I think, very interesting work to be done on inflation and the cost of inflation and growth based on this kind of regression, which I think has not been much explored. But it's orthogonal, largely orthogonal to what I've been focusing on. Okay. So now, financial development. It could be that the counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy is a reflection, in fact, of financial development. In fact, you have. I am a more financially developed country. That's why I can be more counter-cyclical. For example, in bad times, the government could borrow. It's easier to borrow from abroad, and that's why I can also be more counter-cyclical. So you see, the financial development that applies to firms, in a sense, apply also to governments, and that's why they could be more counter-cyclical. And now you can control for the interplay between financial dependence of the sector and the average private credit to GDP ratio in the country. You find effects, like that's the Rajan-Zingales, in fact, effect, which is not so big for OECD countries, interestingly. But when you control for that, it does not affect the interplay between cyclicality of fiscal policy and financial dependence of the sector. So you have a Rajan-Zingales effect, pure Rajan-Zingales, but it's on top of the previous one, you see. That's the thing you find. And last thing I want to talk about is average fiscal policy. It could be the case that in fact, your counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy just reflects a better designed fiscal policy. For example, more counter-cyclical fiscal policy could just reflect a higher fiscal discipline in the country. So what we do here, we do a horse race between the interaction between external finance and the counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy, and financial dependence, and the average total fiscal balance. And you see that the race is won overwhelmingly by the counter-cyclical fiscal policy. It doesn't mean that you should not be disciplined, but it means that the big advantage of discipline plays through the fact that it allows you to be more counter-cyclical. You see what I mean? You don't have a big effect on top of. So fiscal discipline is good because it allows you precisely to be more counter-cyclical, and that's the main channel whereby this is good for long-run growth. You see? So it's not that I'm not advocating fiscal discipline, but that the way it works is this. So now that we came to the conclusion of this first thing, counter-cyclical fiscal policy raises long-run industry growth, all the more so in industries with higher external financial dependence. I believe for future research, you should look at other interactors. I look for external dependence, but you could look at asset tangibility in the sector. We started to look at it, we get similar things, capital-labor ratios and other things, as other interactors. You could look at the composition of government expenditure, consumption, investment, and you can look between macro and industrial policy, because when we start doing counter-cyclical fiscal policy, now not only you have ECFIN against you, but now you start having the competition commission against you in Brussels. So, that I think is a very interesting issue in itself, to which extent, you can say that it's truly macro policy you are doing and not disguised bad industrial policy you are doing. So just on consumption and investment, let me just show you a table, when you interact government consumption, the cyclicality of government consumption, there is very significant. So it seems that a lot of action goes from the consumption part of the deficit. So we know already that it's the expenditure, it's not so much the revenues, it's the expenditure of government you want to be counter-cyclical, and particularly in consumption here. You might say, why not investment? Or now investment, you see much less of an effect. And why is that? And our take on it is because, in fact, with investment, what happens is that investment is typically targeted to particular sectors. But remember that in these regressions, I control for industry fixed effect. So when you have targeted policies and you control for industry fixed effect, the control for industry fixed effect absorbs, in fact, most of the effect of the targeted policy. The difference is that consumption increase is much less targeted towards particular sector. You see, so that's the big difference, is that one is targeted, the other one is much less targeted. So there is the issue. It could be just that it has an effect, but it's swallowed by the industry fixed effect, or that objectively you want to put more emphasis on consumption part of government than on investment, and that's something which is still to be sorted out. So, so that's the. Oh, there is a slide missing because this, you see, that finishes the first part of the talk. Okay. That's on macro policy. Are you still alive? Are you still alive? Well, you never say. Okay. Do you want me to go? Who wants me to go on with the next? Who doesn't want me to go on with the next? I go on? I go on. Well, it's true. It's a bit to ask this question. It's okay. So, Nick, how are you doing? Yes, yes, yes. Whoa. Okay, so there was a slide here called growth. It was a title slide called part 3, and it was very nicely put, growth and the environment. So you missed, imagine the slide, like 20th century Fox, growth and the environment. So, okay, so here we are. Okay, and now we go to, I start like this because you will suffer a little bit on math, but look, I will spoon feed you with the math. So you will see some equations, but just listen. If you don't like to see the equation, don't look at them. It's like vertigo, you see. Don't look at it. If you see the black curve, don't look at it, and you will find. And if you can, oh God, already because I mentioned that I have, and I didn't show math already. Okay, so you have a growing concern. There is a growing concern that economic growth is not sustainable because of the negative impact on the environment, pollution, global warming, or the depletion of natural resources. And for many years, until people started to do endogenous growth, we had models that would tell you that, of course, with limited resources, you cannot have long-run growth. Even AK model, the easy AK model, the one, tells you that if the production depends on the exhaustible resource, the AK model, in fact, tells you there is no long-run growth. Why? Because in an AK model, knowledge is capital accumulation are the same thing. So the only way you can escape a resource is by innovating. But innovation in an AK model, it's capital accumulation. And but to accumulate that capital, you have to produce more, and therefore to use more of the resource. So if you want to look at growth, sustainable growth in an AK model, it's like a snake eating its own tail. You want to grow by innovating, but then you eat your own tail, you see, in order to innovate. And that's the AK. The AK is a snake eating his own tail. So the only hope is to have a model where knowledge and capital accumulation are two different things. And that's why you get into the Schumpeterian type of models, okay? And that's where we... Alors, the common point with the previous thing is that we will look at taxation policy. And again here, even short-term taxation policy can have a long-run effect. So that will be the common point between this and the previous, is that short-term short-term fiscal policy can have also long-run effects on growth, okay? But through a different channel, okay? Of course, I should also mention Nick's report, which assesses the cost of not acting on climate change. But of course, there is a debate that you didn't use endogenous growth models. How would you reassess the cost and benefits of acting on climate change once you factor in the fact that when you tax dirty input, you induce innovation on clean inputs? So that might reduce the cost after all. Maybe we overestimated the cost, maybe not, to which extent? So those are big questions, and I won't answer them here. And there is a large literature on sustainable growth in environmental disaster, but all of them look at exogenous growth. Okay, so for example, there's been a very interesting work by a guy in Syracuse. Now that's a very funny story. I wanted to collaborate. It's the only time I could not collaborate with someone because I'm afraid of flying. To go from Boston to Syracuse, you need to take propellers. It's the only way. And so we were supposed to meet, and we canceled the meeting. So that's a fantastic. It could have been a fantastic collaboration, but they don't have jet planes from Boston to Syracuse. And therefore, we never took off the collaboration. The plane did without me, but not the collaboration. Okay? So that's the story. You see, so what he showed these guys, what he showed is that more energy saving. You see, they look these guys at an oil shock, and you look at whether the oil shock had induced innovations in various sectors. And what he found, in fact, using panel data, cross-sector panel data, is that in fact increase in energy price had induced more patenting in sectors in the US, which were energy-saving sectors, you see? So really what you had is induced innovation, and he used patent measures to show that there was something. Though there is evidence that when you are facing increased price on energy, for example, you innovate to save energy. But in the same way, if I tax energy use because it's dirty, it will have the same effect as an oil shock, and it will induce innovation in a clean input, and that's what we are exploring here. So that what I will be doing here is to do theory, but I'll show you a bit how I do with theory, and I will explain theory really, well, you know, to make it the sugar that makes the medicine go down, huh? The story of... So the big question I'm asking, here now is, knowing that tax on dirty input induce technological change, innovation aimed at saving on these dirty inputs, how should we rethink the taxation of dirty input activity? So this is a bit of jargon, okay? But it means that you produce using a dirty basket and a clean basket, okay? So you produce using these two. The dirty activities deplete the stock of environmental capital, but on the other hand, you have a regeneration at some rate of environment. And of course, the primary effect of a tax on dirty production activities and innovation activity will be to encourage innovation in the clean production technology instead. We said, well, to say such a triviality, you don't need to write a model, no? So I tried to, that's what I took about economics to my dad. My dad said, well, what is this equation out there? But then he asked me a kind of stupid question. He said, come on, if it's all this equation to say something so stupid, well, you need to write all your models and things. So I tried to convince you that I can get from modeling more than this kind of obvious statement. Okay? That's my challenge. So the kind of preview of the main results I will try to argue and try to explain the intuition for you is that an economy in laissez-faire, without tax and subsidies, can often end up in a disaster. That means that people don't internalize the environmental externality, and at some moment the environment becomes so bad that everything collapses in the economy. So you end up you can produce disaster, and I will show you why. But now, the government can achieve long-run sustainable growth when you could not in an AK model, with a temporary policy inducing a switch from dirty innovation and production to clean innovation and production. And what's interesting is that if the dirty and clean baskets are sufficiently substitutes in the production of final good, you don't need to have a long-lasting tax. You could have a temporary tax. And in fact, what you might want to do, if you don't discount the future too much, if you're not too impatient, is to be kind of shock therapy now, suffer a lot now, because very quickly then you can get rid of that tax, you see? The more you do now, the more quickly you can get rid of the tax. On the other hand, if the basket and the clean and the dirty baskets are complementary, then you have a problem, because if you innovate on the clean, if you induce innovation on the clean, you always need the dirty, but the dirty input becomes more scarce compared than the dirty, because you are less productive on the dirty activities than on the clean ones. And the scarcity increases the relative price of dirty inputs. But because the relative price has increased, it's very profitable to do production there. And you want to prevent that, and to prevent that you need all the time to tax the dirty activities, to counteract this price effect that always brings you back to the dirty activities. And in that case, you need a permanent, more permanent tax policy on dirty inputs. Okay? Then when we look at the case where dirty input production requires the use of an exhaustible resource, in that case, laissez-faire economy may lead to sustainable long-run growth under broader conditions, because what happens is that the relative increase in the relative price of the dirty input, because it becomes more difficult to produce, it's true it's more scarce, but it's also more costly to extract. You see, as the less resource you have, the cost of extraction goes up, and this increasing cost of extraction acts like a tax already. So sometimes it may be such that you don't need to tax, because the extraction cost may be sufficient to do it. In some cases, that's a theoretical possibility, that sometimes you would be able to avoid the tax if the extraction cost is sufficiently sharply increasing. So now then there is a two-country world, and that's a very interesting thing. You now move to a country where the world where you have north and south, and you have the north, and the south imitates the north, essentially. So then you have like two externalities between north and south. On the one hand, you have an environmental externality. Both of them dump dirty stuff that deteriorates the global environment. So you have an environmental externality. But you also have a knowledge externality, because the knowledge of the north is mediated by the south. And what happens is that sometimes the technological spillover can make it in such a way that you don't need to tax the south. For example, it could be enough. You see, very often people say it's the China that we could tax. We say, no, maybe not China. Why don't we tax the US, France, UK on dirty activities? They innovate only on clean. But then because China imitates the state of the art in European world, they will imitate the clean. And so you don't need to tax China anymore, because the technological spillover will do the trick. And unfortunately, it doesn't work always. You need enough substitutability, you need certain conditions to be true. And particularly one thing that becomes important is that if you allow now free trade with China, China could say, you tax clean dirty production in the UK, for example, or in the US. I can, and now there is trade liberalization, I could specialize in the production of dirty things. And that's a kind of a perverse effect that free trade introduces. And in that case, free trade might go together with saying, okay, free trade, guys, but then you have to tax your dirty activities. We cannot have both free trade and you not taxing, because then the effect I was mentioning before may not play anymore. You see, and then you get into all this area of how trade and environmental policy play with each other, and you get into conditional trade very naturally, you see. That's the, now you got the paper, I could stop there. You are up? So now I just show some math, but that's it, that's the content, you see? You see how it's simple it is, no model, no equation, no nothing. Okay, now all what I do is to show how the dress was made. You know, it's like a dress, or you show the dress, it's a nice dress, but then you have to show what it's called the patron. How do you call the model, how do you call the thing where you put the clothes on in English? We say le patron, we say the boss in French. It's a French word, I mean, say le patron, but I don't know how you're using that. So now I show the patron of this, okay? Okay, so I will show you the basic model, I will characterize the optimal policy, and that's the most mathematical. So tomorrow is much less mathematical, so don't think that tomorrow will be like today. Today is the kind of showing, you know, proving yourself that you can be followed, but tomorrow the reward, it will be much easier, okay? So you don't think I'm going like this, I'm going more like that. I'm inverted U. So in difficulty. So that's the outline that I will follow. So let's go slowly, okay? I do what I do. How much longer do I have? I have like 5 minutes? 5 minutes? 5 minutes.
Leave time for questions.
Oh yes, they leave time for questions. Okay, so I will just go you know, very, I think, you know, essentially I said most. I mean, I just show you how it's done. You see how you do it, okay? That cook recipe. You take a dirty basket, you take a clean basket, and together they produce final outputs, okay? And these guys there reflect the degree of complementarity. So, for example, if epsilon is much bigger than 1, this goes to 1. For example, if epsilon becomes plus infinity, these guys become 1, and you have essentially y equal yc plus yd. That's a case of perfect substitutability. But when epsilon is small, it's a case of complementarity. So that's a key parameter, because you remember my story that temporary tax in the substitutable case, the non-temporary tax in the complementary case. Okay? Now these guys, yc, yd, are produced with intermediate inputs, and the innovation are on the quality of the intermediate input. So growth in this model is generated by innovation that can either go to improve dirty inputs that produce the dirty basket, or clean inputs that produce the clean basket. And that's what the government policy will do, is to try to influence how much innovation goes there or there. Okay? So now the production of the dirty input, the S, there is a variable S, which is environment. And environment accumulates, but you see the problem is that dirty production reduces the S. You see, when you do dirty production, you deteriorate the environment. But on the other hand, environment, I'm sorry, I didn't want to mean to. Environment has the nice quality of regenerating a little bit, you see? So you have the delta is the rate of regeneration. So you have this help, but on the other hand, you should be careful on how much YD you produce. If you produce too much YD, you deteriorate the environment. Now you can see why is it bad? S doesn't appear neither here or here, but it appears on next slide. Because you see your utility, so here you could put it on production as well, but here the utility of individuals depends on S. Essentially, when S is when S is very below 0, essentially you die. Okay, so there is no utility or minus utility, but so that's not good. But the environment has also something nice here, is that when you have enough fresh air, you don't need fresher air. If I am in Richmond Park, it will not change my life that I go from Richmond Park to Val d'Isère, for example. That's what I assume here. I'm already very happy in Richmond Park, and I don't need to go. Maybe you said that it's up, and it's a bad example, but Isabella Plantation. Well, so the idea that U is satiated in S, I mean, beyond certain level of S, you don't need more. Well, you are okay. You see what I mean? You are satiated in environment, but you need to have a minimum amount. And in fact, you have to maximize intertemporal utility, volatility dependence on consumption, and this S. You could put the S in the production. Okay, so innovation now can either increase the AIJ, it multiplies the AI by 1 plus gamma. And the more scientists you hire to do this, in fact, the higher the probability of innovating. Okay, so if you hire more people on innovating on clean, you are more likely to innovate on clean. If you hire more people to innovate on dirty, you are more likely to innovate on dirty. Okay, so that's and of course, then people will choose. So that this condition looks trivial, but it comes after a lot of calculation. Innovation will occur in the clean sector if and only if this inequality holds. And then you have like two effects. So if epsilon is greater than 1, it means that you always tend to innovate in the sector which are the most productive. So you see that will be very interesting, because that gives you already the idea of the temporary tax. If with the temporary tax, I force innovation for a while, only in the clean sector, so then at some moment the AC becomes bigger than the AD, and then I'm fine, because then automatically this inequality is satisfied, and people will stop innovating in the dirty, and I'm done. But you see that on the other hand, when epsilon is less than 1, there is a reverse effect, and the reverse effect is because of the price effect. It's because when you innovate more on the clean, the dirty input be more scarcer, and that brings you back. And that's the epsilon minus 1 is the component of the productivity effect and the price effect. And that's the whole economics of this model. If you understand this inequality, you got the whole model. You see? That's what's that. So now you say that the disaster occurs if the environmental quality reaches 0 in finite time. And the first result is that you have a sufficiently low rate of regeneration of environment, and you start from a high level AD0 of AC0, but then if you start from a high level of that, people will tend to go produce in the dirty and not in the clean, and they will in fact, because you don't have enough regeneration, they will in fact, the laissez-faire economy will go to oblivion. You see? And that may happen. So that's a model where, you know, we nicely, happily go into the wall. No? Say, go into 0. Okay. So now here come the governments. Okay, the government comes and say, I can deal with the pollution externality, knowledge spillover externality, and monopoly distortion, and I can do welfare improvement. So now the government is so good. This is just to show you that when you do a social welfare maximization in economics, it looks always awful like that. Don't leave. Wait, let me just to show you how bad it is. You maximize intertemporal consumption, that's intertemporal welfare, subject to resource constraints. So I just wrote here the equation how you produce final output. Intermediate output consumption is final output minus consumption of intermediate input, and that's the environment equation. That's the fact that the labor is limited by labor supply. That's the productivity equation. Remember, that's the rate at which you innovate on innovation on sector AJ, and that's the fact that you have the researchers, the number of researchers is given. So you do something like this, but what's nice with it is that you get a very nice formula. You can characterize the optimal tax policy, and it takes this very nice form. In fact, you can implement the social optimal through a tax on the dirty input, on the use of it, a tax subsidy on the profits realized in the dirty sector to allocate innovation, and a subsidy in the use of intermediate inputs to get rid of the monopoly distortion. But what's very interesting is the expression for the input tax, the tax you give on production of dirty or clean baskets. And what's very interesting is that we know that, suppose that, for example, the goods, so let's look at it in more detail. When the goods are sufficiently substituted, I know that at some moment, suppose you tax the dirty input sector, and you know that when goods are sufficiently substituted, anyway, people will stop producing a dirty input. So that means that at that point, because environment regenerates at rate delta, and you stop producing YD, you will have environment increasing. You go way beyond Richmond, okay? But because you go way beyond Richmond, S goes to infinity, and because I have satiation in my utility, you see, it means that in finite time, there is no need to put a taxation because this term becomes equal to 0. So this tells you right away that when you have sufficiently substitutable inputs, taxation is temporary. You don't need permanent taxation. But of course, on the other hand, if the goods are complementary, then it's a different story because in fact, what happens when epsilon is small, the dirty input basket remains necessary for final production all the time, and all the more when productivity has increased in the clean sectors, because the more clean means you need to use more dirty with it. And this calls for permanent taxation of dirty production to prevent disaster, because when you have innovating on the clean, you increase the demand for dirty input, which is complementary to the clean input, you see. And that's why you want to maintain the tax forever. So that's all what it's saying here. When you have high epsilon, temporary tax does. When you have low epsilon, you need to have input and profit tax permanent to make sure that you don't go into disaster. So that's all. Now you say, well, what do we get from this in terms of taxation? Suppose I go back to Nick. Nick asks me, okay, it's very nice math, or maybe not very nice, it's not very elegant, but okay, what should you tell me? Well, so Nick, so far what we could say is that long-run economic growth can be preserved by a tax policy, which already is something. You can preserve long-run economic growth. But this may require a reduction of economic growth in the short run, particularly in the case where you have substitutability between dirty and clean basket. The more substitutable they are, the more harsh you want to be in the short run to very quickly get out of the taxing, and that's what you would like to do, the shock therapy. And also you want to not just input tax, you will have a profit tax to reallocate research labor, okay? So you want both, switch soon to clean production and innovation, and add a profit tax or subsidy to innovation in addition to the usual carbon tax that you are considering, okay? So I should continue. I should not continue. Here is the case where you have a resource, an exhaustible resource to produce the dirty, and the resource depletes here, but there is extraction costs that increase. That with the lower Q, the higher the marginal cost of extraction. And once you have that, you have this term, and you see it is very similar to before. So now you have this term. So you see that when epsilon is greater than 1, the extraction cost will induce more going to the clean, because going to the dirty means that you have to pay this higher extraction cost. It's like a tax. But when epsilon is less than 1, this plays against you, because it means that in fact the price effect will have even worse effects than it had before. So you see the extraction cost has opposite effects depending on whether you have complementarity or substitutability between the clean and the dirty inputs. That's what you get from a model that you could not get without the model. Huh? So, but what's nice is that when epsilon is greater than 1, you can avoid, the laissez-faire economy can avoid disaster more often, because this C of Q plays the role of the tax. Okay, so now the two-country case. The two-country, what I had in mind was just this, that you have a north and a south. The south acquire the technology of the north with the productivity, the probability that depends only on northern variables, whereas the pollution depends on the production of dirty in the north and the south. So this is the environmental externality, whereas this is the technological externality, you see? And so you have two types of externality: environmental, that pushes towards free riding. If it's just for the environmental externality, China would free ride on UK, or UK would free ride on China. It's more like, but because of the knowledge externality, the South is more willing to switch to clean technology once the North has done so. And so what you want to know is what is the interaction effect between the two. And in fact, you have this equation. Again, you get to something which depends again on whether you are substitute or complements. And you have several forces at work. But the bottom line is in fact that in the substitute, either in the basket are sufficiently substitutes or complements, in fact the technological spillover helps you. It's only in the intermediate region that the spillover doesn't reach you. Because when you have substitutability, the north will move to clean forever, and then you will do the same. If it's very complementary, the north will very limit both the south, the innovation on the clean and dirty input. Sorry about that. And in that case, it's fine because you imitate something that doesn't grow too fast. So you are still okay. The case where you're not okay are intermediate case of substitutability between clean and dirty input, where there you may have to tax the south, not just rely on the technological externality. So, the main lessons are this, and I'm done. Temporary taxation of dirty is enough to, when substitutability decays, to achieve long-run growth sustainability. And the use of exhaustible resource helps the switch toward clean innovation if goods are substitute enough. In the two-country case, a tax on dirty innovation production in the north may be sufficient to sustain global growth if you have sufficiently large knowledge spillover, but less so if you have free trade between north and south, because then the south would have the perverse reaction of going a lot into dirty stuff that they could sell cheaply in the north, and that you want to avoid. And that's the kind of thinking that we have. So I think I will stop there for today. You've been extremely brave. I want to thank you for your patience. Tomorrow will be easier ride. Thank you.
I'd like to compliment him in that he was the only lecturer I've ever seen at the LSE or anywhere else who has turned lecturing into a performance art. It's extremely watchable. You should have a video not just of his head, but of his whole body and his gestures. As you know, when the French speak, they speak with their whole body and their hands, and not just their faces. This is the most endearing characteristic which he is clearly imported into the Anglo-Saxon world by advantage. We now have time for a few questions, so we would like to start. There's
yes.
a roving mic, so
yes.
We just wait for the mic.
No.
I understand that
the mic isn't on.
Yeah.
This theory you
want to speak into.
Yes.
will have a big impact on how policymakers are thinking.
Yeah.
But do you think that the assessment of the risk of dirty energy is sufficient to influence policymakers? Do you have that?
What we haven't done yet is to calibrate, what we do say calibration on the model. You see, what we'd like to do now is to put numbers and to say how big these effects will be. So already we saw with the Bob table that, you know, effects of tax or price on innovation are substantial. But so the idea would be to extrapolate from the oil crisis, you see, because there we saw people, you know, escaping the crisis by innovating, so we could get a sense of the magnitude of effects that from there, to try to see now what will be the effect of a tax. That's the challenge too. That's the thing to be done, which I've not done yet. You see, it's really to say, now we could use the previous episodes of oil shock, etc., to get the number of the magnitude of effects. And then I'd like to see, now that we know this magnitude of effect, how will we do another STEM report, you see what I mean? Where we will reassess the costs and benefits of taxing dirty, CO2, etc. Because taking into account, and my guess is that the cost will be less because the STEM report doesn't take into account the fact that you have induced technological change. And there is a whole debate also on discount rates, you know, between Nix and Weizmann, which is the right. But on both sides of the debate on the discount rates, they don't factor in for the moment the endogenous technical change dimension, which I think is first order. I think Nick also believes it, by the way. But I should not speak for him, but he told me that he believes it.
Another question?
Yes.
Just a question. Just a question on the globalization issue. Obviously, the extension to the G20 and looking at issues around the world. I think it's becoming evident that there's probably imbalances in the world economy. From a policy perspective, do you think it's going to be necessary going forward that we address these imbalances to the benefit and competitive nature of individual national states? Or do you think we're going to go towards more blocked countries competing with each other within blocks?
There is a risk, I mean, there is a risk, you know, that in the absence of coordination, you go that after the crisis of the 30s, that people went back to protectionism. So you could imagine, for example, China not cooperating on exchange rates, for example. Then the Americans said, we let the dollar go down because we have a lot of debt vis-à-vis the foreign countries. That would be a way to reduce the revalue of our debt. We let the dollar go down again. And of course, the euro cannot go down. You can let the pound go down, but the euro, we cannot so easily let the euro go down. We would not. But maybe then the reaction would be in that world that European countries would become protectionists. To say, since the monetary side doesn't replicate to what the Fed is doing or what the Bank of England might do, we would respond. Then countries would, with trade restrictions. So there is a danger of a non-cooperative response to the crisis. And I think there is a big need, both on environment and on financial regulation and on exchange rate, to have China and India part of a group where you coordinate, where you say, look, so for example, now you are exporting a lot, now you can rely less on export, maybe a bit. You have to build up your internal demand. Maybe that implies an adjustment of your exchange rate. Maybe you have various things to do, you see what I mean? And maybe we can discuss that. It's not that we tell you what to do, but we could have at least a dialogue and we have an idea of what each of us is doing. And I think...
do you think there's a risk, because there's a suspected suspicion that the growth of the West has been created predominantly by the credit bubble, and therefore taking away the factors of production, i.e. what is it that we produce that actually contributes to a GDP and therefore a comparative indicator. Therefore you get into the debate.
Yeah, so the Greeks, can you still have high growth without, I mean, you could say, well, it could be, for example, look, Scandinavian countries, for example, they grew pretty fast. They had a big banking reform. Look, Finland and Sweden. Look at Finland. They went through a big banking crisis. They renationalized their banking system for a while. And then it was true that they had a world outside which was growing fast, so they could take advantage, whereas now we are not in the same situation. But they did a big banking reform. They had 4 years of hardship. But then they went into a new type of growth based on very different type of production they were doing before. And they played on knowledge. They played on the higher education, on the kind of things I talked about yesterday. Knowledge, R&D, high tech, and that worked very well. And I think that's a good strategy. Now it's true that high tech benefits a lot from venture capital, so you want to make sure that venture capital financing is there, equity financing is there. But of course, and the big question is that you want to make sure that the financial regulation you put in place doesn't kill this good form of financing, which is venture capital and business angels and these guys. So that's the big question, to make sure that you regulate in a way that will not kill the baby with solving the problem. But I think the example of this country should make us optimistic. That when it can be, and it prompted them to go into new kind of growth. You see what I mean? Driven by other type of things. So it was a way for them, and that's my kind of virtue of bad times. They had a virtue of bad times. It pushed them towards a kind of, and they had long-lasting growth for the past 15 years. 13 years, they have high growth in Finland and in these countries, and based very much on innovation driven. So I think that's what we have to be able to do, and that's why it will be wrong to go into protectionism, because protectionism is not so good for innovation.
What do you think of the theory in relation to that?
So we should maybe let other people. We should have. But we can discuss a bit more. Yes. Yes, you have a question.
Well,
no. Yes, you have. Yes. Yeah.
So earlier you showed the benefits of counter-cyclical fiscal policy.
Yes.
But how do you expect that countries will commit to saving in the good times?
That's a big problem, and so we try to think about ways to do that. I mean, the kind of so, for example, we were thinking that when we were working on the Sapir report, we said, could we have some kind of rainy day funds? So rainy day funds are funds. So for the moment, if France decides to save in a good time, it's counted as an expenditure. You see what I mean? If you want to save, the saving is counted as an expenditure, not as a saving. You see what I mean? So you need to have a kind of European agreement. So it's a way to do. You have a kind of common fund, so that when you do this saving in good time to keep for bad times, it's good for you. It's counted in the right way. So you need some kind to run these rainy day funds. You need to have some kind of European arrangement for that. So I guess this kind of way to, or you could imagine rights like pollution rights. if you go outside the counter-cyclical too much, you pay more. You see what I mean? You have to pay like pollution rights. You see, it's, we could imagine also schemes of that type. But there are ways that you could think of to help induce more counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So there's been a piece of work on that. What are the sources of what makes some countries more or less counter-cyclical? Some of them are more institutional, having to do, you know, with the corruption in the country or the, some kind of a deeper feature. But there are things that one can do, I think, to help increase the counter-cyclicality. In fact, in the UK, you increase the counter-cyclicality a lot over the years. And I think, I don't know, was it the inflation target, was it the move to inflation target? Was it a kind of, certain kind of move that you've done in monetary policy that make also easier to have counter-cyclical fiscal policy? I wonder if you had to say that, you know, inflation target will be the thing that we work around and that increase the counter-cyclicality of fiscal. So you might have devices also on the monetary side that also help more counter-cyclical fiscal policy.
Yeah. Questions? Perhaps I could just put one from the chair, if you'll permit me. I think there are two views about the effects of a recession on this investment that we need in clean technology, which, as we said, implies lower economic growth for a time. Is it the case that the recession will make it more difficult to take these measures that might require further cutting growth? Or is it the case that there will be spare resources because of the recession which are there to be invested in clean technology?
Yeah. So you asked a very good question. In fact, it's true, you have a good effect of recession, which we call cleansing effect of recession. So recession have a good aspect that they force firms to innovate in order to survive, and they also weed out usually firms that refuse to innovate, you see, but then it's good if you can relocate, if you have a good labor market that helps, you know, whereby labor and also good credit market whereby capital and labor can be reallocated from losing sectors to winning sectors. So the problems of it comes when this reallocation doesn't operate. So one thing is to say, let's help this reallocation. I don't want to help the lame ducks. Those who refuse to innovate, I should not keep helping them. But I should help reallocation of resources from those firms to guys who innovate. So I should say, well, if you innovate, I reward you. But if you don't innovate, I don't reward you. So you have to make it in a way that the reward for innovating is bigger, and that if you don't innovate, still you can the labor and capital can be relocated to more innovating sectors.
So the implication is that we let the car industry sink without trace, and we invest in more travel by space rockets direct from...
No, or you do something else. You could say, you know, you could land and say, I do some landing to the car sector, but then if you don't do certain kind of thing, then you are in trouble again, then I can force you into Chapter 11. And there is a fantastic thing in the US called Chapter 11, which is called bankruptcy. And here you have the same in the UK. You have administrative receivership, administrative bankruptcy. No? Is it administrative receivership? I think something administration, which is this procedure of bankruptcy reorganization. So the firm goes bankrupt, the assets are still running, but you force a reorganization of the firm through bankruptcy. And I think bankruptcy has this virtue. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And then the firm either reorganizes or does not reorganize, and you still give it a chance to reorganize. I think that those would be the kind of policies.
Thank you. Well, I think we have to bring this evening to an end, but we have another wonderful lecture to look forward to tomorrow.
Culture.
At 6:30. I think it's in this hall, but they don't really show the physical lecture. Let the default be that the lecture takes place here, if it doesn't really tell. Okay, Richard.